I started college as a musical theater major, and I went on to be a history major, and I focused on medieval and Renaissance British history, which was not the most practical thing that I could have majored in. At a certain point, I needed to get more practical about what I was going to be doing in my life. So I decided I was going to go to law school.
24-year-old Jessica Ravel grew up in New Jersey and is in her second year of law school at Rutgers University when the unthinkable happens nearby.
Okay, it sounds like we have some breaking news to tell you about out of New York. There's a
fire burning in the World Trade Center right now. We're just hearing about that right now.
Afterwards, I wanted to do something to help. Eventually, it kind of came to me that the skills of being a lawyer translated into being able to work in the intelligence community or service in the Navy. It was a place that I really could contribute and do something towards helping after 9/11.
With a vision for her future now crystallizing, Jessica sinks herself into her studies, leaving little time for leisure.
Everything was just going really well, but going into the winter of that year, I realized that the thing that was missing in my life was a guy. What I was looking for was someone like me who was working towards an amazing future. I complained to one of my girlfriends that there just weren't any good men in the world anymore, and she laughed and said, "Oh man, do I have the guy for you." He's in the Navy, he is a doctor, he's really just intelligent and funny, and I think you would get along well with him. So I was all like, yeah, bring that on. Let's see where that could go.
It's early December when Jessica heads down to the Hard Rock Cafe in Philadelphia for a blind date with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis.
I got there first, and when he walked in, I was honestly kind of underwhelmed. He walked in a black t-shirt and black jeans, and he was really pale. And he had this kind of weird flat top haircut. Not too flattering. I mean, not unattractive, but not attractive either. It definitely wasn't love at first sight. Jeff told me that he grew up on the West Coast. His mother ran a school. His father was a pilot. He talked a lot about how he was a flight surgeon in the Navy and his work as an emergency room doctor. There was something I found attractive about him. He was funny, but he was also arrogant. Looking back with hindsight, I think that I made excuses for that. So after the date, Jeff walked me to the train station, and there was no goodnight kiss, which was fine with me at the time. I wasn't sure even that I liked him.
And Jessica isn't sure whether Jeffrey likes her either, until she gets a call from him the following week asking for a second date.
I said, yeah, why not? I didn't have a bad time with him, so why not go out with him again? When we went out for the second time, we actually decided that we were going to get Chinese food and watch a movie at my house. So he came to my door, and before he even walked through, he said, "Hey, Chunky Butt, how are you doing?" And I just kind of looked at him, and I was like, what woman wants to be called Chunky Butt? So I actually said to him, "Hey, could you please not call me that, because it's just not cool." I was a beauty queen. I spent time in a swimsuit being judged on my appearance. Being called Chunky Butt, at that time, it was just so not true.
It's an awkward beginning to their evening, but the tension eases up.
We set up the movie and started eating, opened a bottle of wine, and, just talked. We were having a pretty good time, and we got through most of the bottle of wine, and suddenly I have no idea what happened. I do remember being in my kitchen and him kissing me. And that was the last thing that I remembered until the next morning. All of a sudden, he's in my bed, And I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I do? I totally didn't mean to do that. That wasn't on my agenda for the evening. There should have been no reason for me to black out after, let's say, half a bottle of wine. Even if I had drunk the entire bottle of wine, blacking out just isn't something that happens to me. So kind of waking up not remembering anything was strange.
That blackout period, that time she can't account for, to wake up and not know why or how somebody is still there, that unknown is very scary.
Jessica doubts herself to the point where she wonders if Jeffrey will have a bad opinion of her for sleeping with him so quickly.
But when he woke up, he told me what a great time he had last night. So I just said to myself, you know what, I might as well at this point go out with him again, since we've already gone there. And that morning we went for breakfast. And at some point it turned into a relationship that at first was really nice. He was charming. He was attentive. We talked a lot about having a future together and what that may look like. I remember we went to dinner one night in an Italian restaurant. And this restaurant had kind of an alcove where there was a table for two. No one had ever done something like that for me before. It was very romantic. So at some point, the relationship, it just worked. We were happy. I was happy with him. I was happy with where things were going. He was a good guy. And I was looking forward, into what a future might look like with him.
The relationship becomes serious, but the demands of Jeffrey's job means their time together is often disrupted.
He would frequently call me and say, all right, sorry, I got to go off and save lives. And then he would come home and tell me that, he had saved a baby or a pregnant woman or, something that would really just pull at the heartstrings, that made me feel good that I was dating this guy who really helped people.
It's been barely 2 months since they met, and Jeff goes radio silent for periods of time. Jessica becomes suspicious until one night when he tells her he has an important confession to make.
He said that he was a non-official cover agent for the CIA. He said that he had gotten special permission to tell me because I was someone who was special in his life, who he felt like he was going to have a future with, and that I needed to know and understand who he was and all of him. It's not that he wasn't an ER doctor and he wasn't a flight surgeon. He was, but they were both a cover for what he did for the CIA.
It's a little over a year since 9/11, and fighting terror is on everyone's mind.
That was a major milestone in our relationship. It was clear that he felt like I was someone he wanted to be a part of his life. In fairness, that was flattering to me that he would get special permission to share something so important, with me. There were periods of time when he would go away, that I wouldn't know where he was or where he was going. And during that time, he always said that it was because he was off fighting terrorists.
It will be years before Jessica discovers the unfathomable truth about what Jeff is really doing while undercover.
Marsalis was audacious. He was bold. He felt that he was never going to get caught.
It was just a very Jekyll and Hyde existence.
I took a sip of the drink that was mine, and I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. I was very confused.
Jessica Ravel is getting deeper into a relationship with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis, hoping that one day they'd get married and become a power couple.
He was helping people, and that was really attractive to me. We talked a lot about a future together and what that would look like with me as the lawyer, him as the doctor.
In January 2002, Jessica and Jeff go to Bermuda for their first weekend getaway.
When we first landed, it was freezing, and there wasn't anyone around. We got to the hotel. I think that it was under construction because it was an off-season. It was not the most romantic environment for a trip.
Jeff suggests they rent a scooter. They ride out to a remote beach, but the journey is far from idyllic.
I started getting scared. Because it was dark and we were the only people there, I told him that I wanted to go back, and he told me no, and he just kept driving. He was swerving the scooter in a way that felt dangerous to me. He was laughing in a way that just felt incredibly unhinged. And I remember just crying and telling him I wanted to go back. And he was like, "What, do you think I'm gonna kill you?" "I'm afraid. I wanna go back. You're not wanting to take me back, and that's just scary."
This could be a test on Jeffrey's behalf of scaring her, but then showing her that nothing's going to happen and he is her protector.
Finally, Jeff climbs on the scooter and they ride back to the hotel.
By the time we got back to the hotel, I was just a total mess. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to be there. And it was one of those situations in which he started telling me, "You're going to have to learn to have my sort of sense of humor."
Jeff's strange mood continues, and he seems intent on baiting Jessica.
He proceeded to tell me about a time that he and his friend, who was also in the CIA, saw two guys coming out of the club, and they thought, let's pick a fight. So they picked a fight with the guys.
And this is when Jeff drops a bombshell.
He ended up killing one of them, and his friend put the other one in the hospital. He told me that when the police came, he basically showed them his CIA card and he got right out of it. That should have been a moment that was just a huge red flag. And I know it sounds probably ridiculous, but he had a way of normalizing things that were just ridiculous and horrible. This is an example of something that I've done with one of my friends. And if you can't appreciate that, then we're not going to be able to have a future together. He had this training, and sometimes instinct just took him somewhere that, normal people don't go. I think that I rationalized that it was part of what he did as part of the CIA.
On another trip, Jeff's vanity is on full display.
We went on this Disney cruise, and then we spent a couple of days in Florida. Jeff was obsessed with taking pictures of him in different settings and different poses and different states of dress. He got really dramatic with the way that he posed. He would, kind of put his head back and smile. And I just found it really strange that he was so obsessed with having these pictures of himself. The one thing that he did express interest in was becoming an astronaut. We then go to Cape Canaveral, where he decides that he needs a picture of himself in an astronaut costume. I remember asking him, well, why do you need to do that if you're going to go to astronaut training? He was like, well, it's just a fun thing to do. After we were done with the photo session, he was very excited about the picture. He actually gave it to me as a gift.
On their first Valentine's Day in 2002, Jeff tells Jessica he wants to show her where he works.
Jeff said he had something really special planned for us. And we went from his apartment to the hospital. He seemed to have access to everywhere. He then proceeded to take me to the cadaver lab. He opened drawers with dead people, showed me different organs. And suddenly he ripped off the guy's arm and then chased me around the cadaver lab with it while he laughed maniacally. I was terrified, and he told me it wasn't a big deal. He asked me why I thought it was such a big deal.
When they return to his apartment, Jessica is furious.
I remember grabbing my bag and just telling him I was leaving, and he blocked the door. He wouldn't allow me to leave. It was just one of the first times I saw behind the mask.
Despite this deeply disturbing incident, Jessica and Jeff continue to see each other. And in the summer of 2003, Jessica graduates from Rutgers Law School.
I took time and did some research into where I might want to be. I ultimately ended up enlisting in the Navy as an intelligence specialist.
Over the next year, Jessica launches her new career as Jeff continues to serve the Navy and CIA in his undercover capacity.
He would be going off on what he called missions. He's playing me recordings of what he says are him interrogating terrorists in Afghanistan, and all I hear is screaming. He played those things for me pretty regularly. I was 24, 25, and at that age, I didn't have a lot of experience with the world. It seemed like, oh my gosh, I knew what the CIA was from movies and TV, and what he was telling me made sense.
Jessica thinks the pressure of Jeff's work or some unknown stressor is making him increasingly controlling.
He started isolating me from my friends, getting me to a point where I needed to rely on him for comfort, for friendship, because I just didn't have anyone else. Either I stopped talking to them or my life was just getting too crazy with him and they stopped talking to me. I came to think that this was just my life and something that I needed to deal with, because if I didn't, people were going to get hurt. He talked about killing people, so there was definitely a part of me that was quite sure he was capable of doing that to me or people I loved.
Jessica becomes scared in her relationship.
I just started looking for coping mechanisms. I would literally go to the gym and do an aerobics class and then run 10 miles a night. So I had an excuse to not be near him. I trained for a marathon so that I wouldn't be able to see him on weekends because I was just afraid.
After more than 2 years of dating, Jeff pops the question in April 2004.
You would think getting engaged is supposed to be this happy, exciting thing. But by the time that, he brought it up, I was already in that state of terror and fear that I didn't ever think I was going to get away from him. So I said, okay. And that was it.
But unbeknownst to Jessica, Jeff is leading a sinister double life.
I totally lost my 20s to this horrible, horrible person. And they're not something that I can ever get back.
After their engagement, Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis asks fiancée Jessica Rovell to accompany him on a trip out west.
His dad was his idol, so it was just a really big deal that I was going out to Park City, Utah to meet his dad. We went skiing, we went shopping. From what I recall, we did a lot of nice things on that trip. Seeing the normalcy of the family really made me question, where did he come from? Because they were just so kind and welcoming.
But it remains a stark contrast to Jeff's disturbing and frenetic energy.
He busts open the drawer and just starts screaming at me. He's got a shotgun and he's pointing it at me and he's just screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." When he was done screaming, he took a pause and he looked at me and said, "Just kidding," and turned around and pranced out of the bathroom. I think at that point, I was just so broken down. I let it go as one of those things that I needed to deal with in my life.
Back in Philadelphia, Jeff's abusive behavior continues.
I remember being on the phone with him, and I didn't care if he killed me. I didn't care if I lived. I just couldn't deal with him anymore. And something just, clicked in my head. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And I hung up on him, and I immediately called 911 and said I needed help. I needed help. And as they were sending police over, I called my mom and I told her everything that was happening. And, it was kind of one of those, why didn't you tell us moments?
The police arrive and escort Jessica safely downtown to file a temporary restraining order.
It could have gone the wrong way any number of times. Handling it the way I did actually may have saved my life.
Soon, Jessica will learn that she is not alone, because Jeff's undercover work for the Navy and CIA has been a cover for something completely different.
It was March of 2004 when I began communicating with Jeffrey Marsalis. It was a time in my life where I was interested in getting married and having children.
Joanne Bottaro Cooper is single with a successful career in marketing when she decides to give online dating a try.
Jeffrey Marsalis' profile looked like he was a good catch. He had pictures of him in his medical scrubs with an astronaut's uniform. He had a lot of other pictures. Jeffrey said that he wanted to meet me out for a date, and I said yes. I lived in New Jersey, so he planned for me to come into Philly.
They go to a popular Irish bar in Philadelphia, the Tur Na Nog, where he describes his thriving career as an astronaut.
I was excited because he actually looked like his profile. As we were chatting and sat down at the bar, he started describing his residency program and the NASA program, and I was interested. He was interesting. He lived in a high-rise apartment building in the city that was also just a few blocks from where we were. So we went down to his apartment. He asked if I wanted a drink. I said no to an alcoholic drink. So I just wanted something non-alcoholic, whether it be water or soda. I sat down on the couch. We started to talk a little bit. He did kiss me. I then took a sip of the drink that was mine. And I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. My head hurt. Every part of me hurt. I was violently ill. I knew I had sex with him. There was no question. But I didn't know why, because I had no intentions of staying over in his apartment, of having sex with him. I blacked out for probably about 8 hours. There's nothing in between my taking the sip of the drink and then waking up the next morning. I chalked it up to maybe not having enough to eat on Friday.
When Marsalis wakes up, his reaction seems to indicate nothing is amiss.
He started chatting with me like everything was normal, like what we did was normal, and I didn't say anything to him that I didn't remember anything. I just kept it all to myself. So I had assumed that I, wanted it, and I can't really explain it. I wish I could, but I can't explain it to myself. I just figured I would just forget about it. I was just gonna put it away and move on.
Over a year after Joanne dated Jeff, Jessica gets an unexpected call from the manager of his apartment building.
She called me and said, "Hey, I think you need to call the Philadelphia SBU." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Why? What happened?" And she said, just call them.
Jessica immediately reaches out.
I remember them asking me questions, and some of them were about him dating other people, and I had no idea.
The special agents tell Jessica that Jeff is accused of raping at least 2 women while she has been engaged to him.
At first, I don't know if I was in denial. I understood what my experience was, but as they were asking me questions about what sounded like the experiences of other women, it just, gosh, I don't even know how to explain it. There came a point when I was talking with the detectives that kind of a light bulb went off, and it all kind of came together. The last couple years of my life were basically one big date rape. I came to understand that it wasn't just me, and that was just so scary.
I have to almost laugh at that. Let's get over the profile. And eventually we're going to see me as the person who I am inside. The caring, the loving, the nurturing, the easygoing, the great guy.
In March 2005, Philadelphia's Special Victims Unit launches an investigation into Jeffrey Marsalis.
The first victim that came in said she had met him on a dating website. They went out on a date. She said they had a couple drinks, went back to his apartment. She woke up with him on top of her. And then wake up the next morning, he kind of sweet talks her into like, hey, we were both drinking, we had a good time, we should go out again. And she did. But after he stopped talking to her, it was really bothering her. And she came in and made a report.
By this time, it's too late to conduct a rape kit or drug test on the victim. But police obtain a search warrant for Jeff's apartment.
The first time he's not home, so we go to the manager of the apartment complex.
When the building manager reads the search warrant, she is visibly distressed.
You can see the blood just like go like this, just go right off her face. And we looked at her, she says, he did the same thing to me. We went to search his apartment. Screensaver had CIA on it. He had a bulletproof vest there. He had a doctor's coat with his name on it.
They also find what appear to be classified CIA documents, all of which are later determined to be forgeries.
Mr. Marsalis was very good and very committed to pretending to be a doctor. And he convinced other doctors, other patients, other people in the hospital that he was Dr. Marsalis. He came from tremendous privilege. He was given the opportunity to go to a number of great schools, but by the time we encountered him, he was a nursing school dropout who went around lying about who he was and victimizing women. What we found on his computer was a list that he kept. He called it the Yearly Calendar of Women, and that contained the first names of a number of women he had had sexual intercourse with.
They found a list of about 50 women.
We were shocked to learn that it wasn't 2 people who were raped by Marsalis or 3 or 4, but it was many, many women who were all victimized in the same way.
One of the names on the list is Joanne Bottaro Cooper.
Someone who worked for the assistant district attorney started to ask me if I knew Jeffrey Marsalis. She explained to me why they were calling me and what he was being investigated for. And at that moment, I had a flood of emotions. Everything that didn't make sense to me back in March of '04 came at me hard. I hung up the phone and I ran into the bathroom and I had an emotional breakdown.
Jeffrey Marsalis is arrested in April 2005, but makes bail and flees to his mother's condo in Utah. Jessica, Joanne, and a group of other victims work with police to prepare for trial.
We came up with a plan between the Philadelphia police detectives and FBI agents. Some of the victims were local, some were in the surrounding counties, some were in other states. And we started to slowly interview all of those individuals.
It becomes evident that none of the witnesses reported the rapes to police in a timely enough manner to conduct drug tests or a rape kit.
The investigation never identified the actual drug that he used. I think the strength of this case was the volume of victims who did not know one another, but yet their stories all were very similar.
The prosecutor chooses the 3 cases he will present at the trial.
I was a witness. They called me the glue that brought everything together. Because he was doing all of this while we were together, I was the baseline, the patient 0. He started with me and then just continued with these other women. were all professional, successful women, just confident. And his mother is a strong woman, an educated woman, a confident woman, a successful woman. And it always struck me as bizarre that he chose his victims almost in the image of his mother.
The victims were very brave for being willing to share their story with the jury. Marsalis' defense attorney told the jury that the victims were lying and that this was all some kind of misunderstanding and that Marsalis was the real victim. Marsalis looked very smug and confident.
Their strategy was, he's a liar, he's not a doctor, he's not the things that he said he was, but he's not a rapist. These were women who were looking for Prince Charming, and he's not that, so they're upset and they conspired together because they had seen him again and then they had a consensual relationship that presented a challenge to get a successful prosecution.
In a controversial ABC interview with Marsalis, he reacts to their accusations of him lying about his profession.
The truth is simple. We had a great time, had consensual sex numerous times with one another. If I'm such a god-awful person, why do you keep on hanging out with me for?
He's extremely excited by it, but he's excited by it because he is gaining control over somebody who he shouldn't be able to get control over. They shouldn't be easy targets. And so therefore, by going after them, he has gained control, and that level of control thrills him, excites him, and just pushes him to do it again and again and again.
At the trial, the defense lawyers adopt a familiar tactic, victim blaming.
What were you wearing? Why did you sleep with him? Why did you sleep with him again? Why did you go out with him again? So it becomes more a focus on the victim's morality, if you will, than it does about the individual, the accused's culpability in the situation. In Pennsylvania at the time, there was no mechanism for there to be psychological testimony as to why rape victims act the way they do in the wake of a sexual assault. And that was problematic because with the jury, the actions that a person takes afterwards are not always what you would expect.
While the jury takes 5 days to deliberate, the victims hold their collective breath.
The result came in, and it was an acquittal.
Let me make something very, very clear to you. I have never drugged anybody. I have never raped anybody. I've never forced myself on anybody, ever.
It was difficult to hear the verdict of not guilty with respect to those 3 women. What Marsalis didn't expect, what caused the smug look on his face to disappear, was when he was arrested in the courtroom for what was going to be a second trial with 7 different women presenting their story to a jury.
After his acquittal and rearrest, victims continue to come forward, and Jeff becomes the focus of a new investigation. But hidden from the proceedings, just 2 weeks prior to the Philadelphia trial, Jeff is living in Sun Valley, Idaho.
His family had some affiliation with this resort, and he got a job there as a security guard.
It's there in October 2005 that Marsalis and a female coworker share a few drinks after work. When she's suddenly unable to walk, he puts her in a taxi and takes her back to his place to repeat a familiar scenario. But this time, Jeff's tried and true technique backfires.
She was a lesbian, and she knew that she was not going to be sleeping with a man. So she knew that she woke up and it wasn't right.
She was not confused about what happened to her. And so because she went to the police right away, the detectives were able to get a rape kit, to get physical evidence proving what had happened. They were able to talk to the bartender who talked about the drinks that were served. They were able to find witnesses who had seen her being dragged out of a taxi cab by Marsalis. This was exactly the kind of evidence that we did not have in Pennsylvania because the victim came forward right away.
Now, with another trial pending in Idaho, Philadelphia law enforcement take Jeffrey Marsalis to trial for the second time in May 2007. The case focuses on 7 women, bringing a total of 66 charges, including rape.
One of the women lived in his building, and a woman who had met Marsalis on a date after coming into Philadelphia from New Jersey.
That woman is Joanne Butaro Cooper.
I gave my testimony, and I got to stare him straight in the face and point at him and accuse him of the crimes he committed against me. That felt very empowering. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. He saw me there, and his face dropped. It felt really good to know that someone could scare him a little bit still.
After deliberating a week, the jury finds Marsalis guilty on 2 counts of sexual assault and impersonating a government official, but without physical evidence, acquits him of all other charges.
They found him guilty of sexually assaulting 2 women.
I was surprised that the jury did not see the truth and that he wasn't convicted on all counts.
He's a felon now, and he will always have to register as a sex offender.
With Jeff finally behind bars, Jessica begins the difficult task of rebuilding her life.
With every moment that you are moving forward and putting it further in your rear view, I look at my own life, and there are some tough years. It's not something that you ever forget. Certainly, it's always there. It's possible to get to a point that it's not the sole influence in your life.
Despite not being found guilty of rape, Marsalis is given a new moniker in the press, the Match.com rapist. It's not until April 2009 that the Idaho case goes to trial.
The jury heard that Marsalis denied having had any kind of intercourse with the victim, and yet a rape kit that was performed showed that he was a liar.
I felt like she was the strongest. She did what all of us hadn't done.
As Jeff enters the court for sentencing, he notices Jessica sitting in the gallery.
He thought he was being smug and he was getting to me. But at the end of the day, my being able to look back at him and, really just signal to him what a dirtbag he is was satisfying and an opportunity to just take my power back, and I did.
After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Marsalis guilty of rape.
When it comes to sentencing, the judge is able to take the dozens of cases from Pennsylvania into account.
The outcome of the 3rd trial was the most satisfying of all of them.
I will sentence you to a term of life imprisonment in the Idaho State Penitentiary.
Jeffrey Marsalis is declared a sexually violent predator.
It was the moment in which I knew that it wasn't wrong. I knew that it was not real. And I'm glad I went to Idaho, because I don't know whether I'd have gotten that closure otherwise.
I questioned myself instead of him, and I will never do that again. And I will make sure that I can speak out and tell women that you should always believe yourself first.
Joanne starts a rape crisis counseling organization, and eventually, through a mutual friend, reconnects with an old boyfriend from college.
I've been married for 3.5 years. I'm extremely happy in my job. I work for a nonprofit, and I just continue to do things that make me happy.
Without the bravery of all the survivors in this case, he'd still be out there doing it.
Jeffrey Marsalis is, in fact, one of the worst serial rapists in Pennsylvania's history.
After the Marsalis case, rape trials in Pennsylvania will never be the same.
When victim after victim shared the same story, and Marsalis was still acquitted of rape, the Pennsylvania legislature responded by changing the law, which allowed expert testimony to come into rape cases so that jurors could better understand the psychology and behavior of rape victims.
I want to let others know that this is not going to define you for the rest of your lives. This is a moment in time, and it sucks. Like, it really, truly sucks. But you get past it.
Jessica goes on to become an intelligence officer in the Navy and spends 20 years working for the FBI.
I'm an investigator at Microsoft now. There are so many good things that have gone on in my life. I'm married. I have 2 amazing, silly dogs, and I've got relationships that are strong with my family, my friends. I talk with universities, with businesses, with government agencies. I want people to know you're not alone. You're not alone. And no matter what you think has been taken away from you, you have the power to grab it back.
There is a distinct duality to a border town, a place where an invisible line drawn on a map dictates jurisdictions, identities, and the very fabric of daily life. Texarkana, resting squarely on the boundary between the states of Texas and Arkansas, is the epitome of this geographic anomaly. Under normal circumstances, this unique position is merely a point of local pride, a quirk of geography that residents navigate with ease as they cross from one state to another simply by walking across the street. But in the spring of 1946, this divided town found itself united by something far more powerful than civic pride. It was united by a paralyzing, suffocating terror. This is the story of a predator who stalked the shadows, a faceless entity who transformed the quiet, secluded roads of a border town into a hunting ground. This is the story of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders and the enigmatic figure at the center of the carnage, a figure forever immortalized in the annals of true crime as the Phantom Killer. The spring season is traditionally a time of renewal, a period when the harshness of winter retreats, giving way to blooming flora and a sense of collective optimism. The air grows warmer, the days stretch longer, and communities typically emerge from the isolation of the colder months. But for the residents of Texarkana in 1946, the arrival of spring brought with it a darkness that no amount of daylight could pierce. Between the months of February and May, a series of brutal, seemingly random attacks shattered the tranquility of the region. The perpetrator did not discriminate by jurisdiction. The terror bled across the Texas and Arkansas borders, leaving a trail of shattered lives and a community perpetually looking over its shoulder. The Phantom Killer became a spectral presence, an unseen menace whose very moniker evoked the elusive, ghostly nature of the crimes. This was an adversary who struck with lethal precision in the dead of night and vanished without a trace, leaving law enforcement baffled and the citizenry in a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. To understand the true horror of the Phantom Killer, one must first understand the visage that the survivors described, an image that has since become synonymous with the darkest corners of the human imagination. The killer did not rely on the cover of darkness alone to obscure their identity. Instead, they employed a crude, makeshift disguise that amplified the psychological terror of the attacks. It was a simple burlap sack, the kind commonly used for agricultural purposes in the rural South. Placed over the head, it concealed every human feature, transforming the wearer from a man into a monstrous, faceless entity. 2 holes were crudely cut into the rough fabric, allowing the predator to see their prey, but offering the victims nothing in return. No recognizable features, no expression of emotion, only the terrifying anonymity of rough, woven burlap and the cold, unfeeling gaze of a murderer peering out from the darkness. This mask was not just a tool for concealment. It was an instrument of psychological warfare, designed to strip away the humanity of the attacker and instill maximum trauma in those unfortunate enough to cross their path. The primary hunting grounds for the Phantom Killer were the isolated, unlit thoroughfares commonly known as lovers' lanes. In an era before the pervasive glow of digital screens and ubiquitous streetlights, these secluded dirt roads on the outskirts of town offered privacy and quiet for young couples seeking a moment of intimacy away from the watchful eyes of their families and the broader community. These couples were inherently vulnerable, parked in the pitch black of the rural landscape, their attention focused entirely on one another. The killer exploited this vulnerability with devastating effectiveness. Slipping silently through the darkness, the Phantom would materialize beside the parked vehicles, shattering the quiet intimacy with a sudden, violent intrusion of a drawn weapon, and a face obscured by a burlap sack. The sanctuary of the automobile, once considered a safe haven, was abruptly transformed into a steel trap. The very isolation that the victims had sought out became their greatest disadvantage, leaving them entirely at the mercy of a ruthless attacker miles away from any potential source of help or rescue. As the frequency and brutality of the attacks escalated throughout that fateful spring, the psychological landscape of Texarkana underwent a radical and terrifying transformation. The Phantom Killer was no longer merely a topic of whispered gossip or alarming newspaper headlines. The killer was a tangible, omnipresent threat that dictated the daily habits of every man, woman, and child in the area. The setting of the sun, once a signal for rest and relaxation, became an omen of impending dread. As dusk approached, a profound silence would fall over the streets. The vibrant nightlife and evening socializing that characterized the town came to a sudden, absolute halt. The local authorities, recognizing the severity of the threat and their inability to predict the killer's next move, imposed strict curfews. The bustling town effectively shut down, retreating behind closed doors and drawn curtains as the shadows lengthened. The youth of Texarkana, the demographic most directly targeted by the early attacks on the lovers' lanes, were perhaps the most profoundly affected. The innocent rituals of adolescence, dating, evening drives, socializing under the night sky, were entirely eradicated. No young couple dared to venture out to the secluded dirt roads. The fear of the burlap-masked phantom lurking in the brush was enough to extinguish any desire for a midnight rendezvous. But the terror was not confined to the young. Following a later attack, in which the killer deviated from the established modus operandi of targeting cars and instead launched a violent assault on an isolated farmhouse, the realization dawned that no one was safe. The Phantom was not just a threat to those wandering the backroads. The monster could strike through the very windows of a locked home, attacking individuals who were simply attempting to go about their quiet, domestic lives. This realization triggered a wave of defensive hysteria throughout the Twin Cities. Hardware stores and sporting goods shops were completely emptied of their inventories of firearms and ammunition. Citizens who had never before held a weapon found themselves sleeping with loaded shotguns resting against their nightstands. The simple act of locking a door was no longer deemed sufficient. Residents fortified their homes with heavy iron chains, securing every possible point of entry against the unseen threat. Some, driven to the brink by the pervasive fear, went so far as to construct elaborate traps around the perimeters of their properties, hoping to catch or deter anyone attempting to approach under the cover of darkness. The community was no longer merely living. They were surviving, entrenched in a state of perpetual siege against an enemy they could not see and did not understand. The magnitude of the crisis drew a massive response from law enforcement agencies across both states and the federal government. The local police forces of both the Texas and Arkansas sides of Texarkana found themselves entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of panic, false alarms, and the lack of tangible evidence left at the crime scenes. Recognizing the need for specialized assistance, an unprecedented coalition of investigators descended upon the town. The Federal Bureau of Investigation dispatched agents to assist in the manhunt, bringing federal resources and psychological profiling to the border town. Furthermore, the legendary Texas Rangers arrived to spearhead the investigation, most notably under the command of the famous Captain Manuel Gonzalez, widely known by his formidable moniker, Lone Wolf. Gonzalez was a towering figure in Texas law enforcement, a man whose reputation for relentless pursuit and uncompromising justice preceded him. The presence of the Rangers and the FBI provided a brief glimmer of hope for the terrified populace, suggesting that it was only a matter of time before the formidable combined forces of the law brought the Phantom to justice. An exhaustive, monumental dragnet was cast over the region. Investigators worked tirelessly, tracking down every lead, responding to every frantic phone call, and analyzing the remarkably scarce clues left behind. The scale of the interrogation effort was staggering. Over 400 individuals were detained, questioned, and heavily scrutinized in connection with the murders. The town was crawling with heavily armed officers, and the local jails overflowed with potential suspects. Yet, despite the immense mobilization of manpower, the unparalleled expertise of the Texas Rangers, and the analytical power of the FBI, the Phantom Killer managed to continually slip through the cracks of the investigation. The perpetrator remained a ghost, a lethal phantom who defied capture and continued to hold the town in a vice grip of terror. The unresolved nature of the Texarkana Moonlight murders elevates the case from a tragic historical footnote to one of the most enduring, agonizing mysteries in the annals of American criminal history. The fact that an individual could commit such brazen, horrific acts of violence, paralyze an entire community, trigger a massive multi-agency manhunt, and ultimately vanish without ever being definitively identified or convicted is a chilling testament to the limitations of justice. The Phantom Killer simply ceased to strike as abruptly as the nightmare had begun, disappearing back into the obscurity from which they came, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a community permanently scarred by the experience. The lack of closure meant that the fear never truly dissipated. It merely evolved into a lingering, generational trauma, a dark folktale whispered to caution those who might venture out too far into the night. This enduring mystery and the terrifying iconography of the crimes inevitably seeped into the broader cultural consciousness, ensuring that the Phantom Killer would never be entirely forgotten. The sheer cinematic horror of a masked assailant hunting in the dark resonated deeply, eventually inspiring works of fiction that would define an entire genre of entertainment. Decades later, in 1976, filmmaker Charles B. Pierce directed The Town That Dreaded Sundown, a cinematic adaptation directly based on the horrific events that plagued Texarkana. The film dramatized the murders, the subsequent panic, and the exhaustive investigation, bringing the story of the Phantom to a national audience and forever cementing the case in popular culture. More significantly, the specific imagery of the Texarkana crimes, the secluded lovers' lanes, the sudden violence in the dark, and most crucially, the crude, terrifying burlap sack mask with uneven eye holes, laid the foundational aesthetic for what would become the slasher subgenre of horror cinema. The distinct DNA of the Phantom Killer can be explicitly traced to some of the most iconic figures in horror history. When the creators of the legendary Friday the 13th franchise sought a terrifying look for their antagonist, Jason Voorhees, before he acquired his signature hockey mask, they placed a burlap sack over his head, a direct visual homage to the real-life nightmare of Texarkana. The true horror, however, lies not in the fictional monsters inspired by the case, but in the harrowing reality that the original monster was flesh and blood, a very real predator who walked the streets of a border town and forever altered its history. The story of the Phantom Killer is not just a tale of murder, it is a profound exploration of fear, the fragility of safety, and the chilling realization that sometimes the monsters lurking in the dark are never brought into the light. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that befell Texarkana in the spring of 1946, one must first transport themselves to the distinct cultural and historical landscape of that era. The Second World War had just concluded a few months prior, bringing an end to years of global bloodshed, rationing, and perpetual anxiety. Across the United States, there was a palpable collective sigh of relief, a triumphant return to normalcy, and an eager anticipation for a prosperous future. Young men who had survived the harrowing battlefields of Europe and the Pacific were returning home to their families, ready to hang up their uniforms and begin the rest of their lives. In a bustling, uniquely situated border town like Texarkana, the streets were thrumming with this renewed, infectious energy. The local economy was stabilizing, families were reuniting, and the youth were reclaiming the carefree adolescence that the war years had effectively stolen from them. It was a time characterized by a profound sense of safety and a belief that the worst of human cruelty had been left behind on foreign shores. This post-war optimism manifested most vividly in the social rituals of the town's youth. In an age before digital connectivity, socializing required physical proximity, and for teenagers and young adults seeking privacy away from the watchful, crowded households of their parents, the automobile was the ultimate sanctuary. The network of unpaved, deeply shadowed dirt roads snaking through the rural outskirts of Texarkana naturally evolved into popular gathering spots. These secluded avenues, universally colloquially known as lovers' lanes, were not places of danger in the minds of the locals. They were innocent spaces where young couples could share a quiet conversation, listen to the radio, and enjoy a romantic evening under the vast, star-filled Texas and Arkansas skies. The isolation of these roads, surrounded by dense pines and marshland, was the very feature that made them appealing. There was an unspoken trust within the community, a deeply ingrained belief that the darkness surrounding their town was entirely benign. That fragile illusion of safety was violently fractured on the night of February 22nd, 1946. Jimmy Hollis, a young man of 24, and his companion, Mary Jean Larey, who was 19, had parked their vehicle on a secluded stretch of road to simply enjoy each other's company after an evening out. They were ordinary young people, entirely unaware that their names were about to become the first entries in one of the most terrifying criminal dockets in American history. The tranquility of their night was obliterated when a figure suddenly materialized from the absolute darkness outside their car windows. The assailant, his face hidden beneath a crude, terrifying burlap sack with jagged eye holes, brandished a flashlight and a heavy firearm. In a matter of seconds, the secluded haven of their vehicle was transformed into a claustrophobic cage of terror. The attacker exhibited a chilling, silent aggression. Jimmy Hollis was brutally struck over the head with a heavy object, the sheer force of the blow fracturing his skull and rendering him immediately incapacitated and helpless. With her companion gravely injured, Mary Jean Larey was left entirely at the mercy of the masked predator. She was subjected to a terrifying ordeal of robbery and physical violation, a deeply traumatic assault that would leave permanent psychological scars. The attacker then vanished back into the rural darkness just as abruptly as he had appeared, leaving the severely battered couple alone in the night. Through sheer will and desperate survival instinct, they managed to seek help. Jimmy and Mary Jean survived the horrific encounter, but their bodies were broken, and their minds were forever haunted by the faceless phantom they had encountered. They were the lucky ones, though they could not have known at the time that they were merely the prologue to a much darker, bloodier narrative. Exactly 1 month later, on March 24th, the Phantom Killer struck again, and this time, the encounter escalated from brutal assault to cold-blooded murder. The victims were Richard Griffin, 29 years old, and Polly Ann Moore, a young woman of only 17. Richard was a man who had already seen his fair share of hardship and danger, having served his country during the war. He had survived the immense perils of global conflict, returning to his hometown with the completely reasonable expectation of living out a quiet, peaceful life. Polly Ann was a teenager on the cusp of adulthood, full of youthful vitality and dreams for the future. Like Jimmy and Mary Jean before them, they had sought out the quiet solitude of a lover's lane, parking their car in a familiar, isolated spot off a rural highway. They were discovered the following morning, and the scene that awaited the authorities was one of chilling, clinical execution. Both Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore had been shot in the back of the head. The trajectory and placement of the fatal wounds suggested a horrifying sequence of events. They were not killed in the heat of a chaotic struggle. Rather, the evidence indicated that they had been ordered out of their vehicle, likely forced into a position of total submission by the masked gunman, and then mercilessly executed in the dark. The discovery of their bodies sent a massive shockwave through Texarkana. The attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larey had been alarming, but the murders of Richard and Polly Ann fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the town. This was no longer just a violent vagrant or a heavy-handed robber. There was an apex predator hunting on the outskirts of their community, an individual who possessed both the capacity and the desire to take human life without hesitation. Despite the escalating panic, the tragic reality of adolescence is a persistent belief in one's own invincibility. On the night of April 14th, less than a month after the previous double homicide, another young couple ventured out into the fateful spring night. Paul Martin, a vibrant 16-year-old boy, had offered to drive his friend, 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker, home after a musical performance. Betty Jo was a highly talented, beloved member of the community, known for her exceptional skill as a saxophone player in a local band. She had spent her evening bringing joy to others through her music, completely oblivious to the horrific fate waiting for her on the drive home. Paul, acting as a reliable friend, simply intended to ensure her safe return. Their youth, their innocence, and their profound potential were violently extinguished in what would become the most savage attack of the entire series. When their bodies were discovered, the sheer brutality of the crime scene horrified even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. Paul Martin's body was found lying abandoned by the side of a rural road, having suffered multiple devastating gunshot wounds. The search for Betty Jo Booker led investigators to a swampy, densely wooded area a significant distance from Paul's body. She, too, had been shot multiple times, her life ruthlessly taken in the cold, unforgiving marshland. The murder of these two incredibly young, deeply loved teenagers broke the collective heart of Texarkana. The community was paralyzed by an overwhelming, suffocating grief that immediately morphed into an absolute, unadulterated terror. The killer was not satisfied with just one horrific act. The violence was escalating, becoming more frequent, and demonstrating an increasingly savage disregard for human life. For a brief, agonizing period, the residents of Texarkana believed they understood the parameters of their nightmare. The killer targeted young people, the killer struck in the dead of night, and the killer hunted exclusively on isolated, rural roads. As long as one stayed indoors, kept the doors locked, and avoided the lovers' lanes, one was presumably safe. This desperate, fragile logic was entirely shattered on the night of May 3rd, when the Phantom Killer drastically altered their established modus operandi, demonstrating a terrifying adaptability and a complete lack of boundaries. The targets were not teenagers in a parked car, but a married couple resting in the supposed sanctuary of their own home. Virgil Starks, a 37-year-old farmer and welder, and his wife, Prudence Starks, lived in an isolated farmhouse situated on a large, quiet tract of land. It was a typical Friday evening. The couple was unwinding from a long week of hard work. Virgil was sitting comfortably in his favorite armchair in the living room, quietly reading the evening newspaper, while Prudence was in an adjacent room. They were miles away from the lovers' lanes, secure behind the walls of their rural homestead, living out a quiet domestic routine. The attack came with absolutely no warning. The killer had crept silently onto their property, positioned themselves outside the living room window, and took careful aim through the glass. A sudden, deafening gunshot shattered the tranquility of the farmhouse. Virgil Starks was struck in the back of the head, killed instantly before he could even register the sound of the glass breaking or the presence of his executioner. Hearing the terrifying noise, Prudence rushed into the living room, only to be met with the sight of her husband slumped in his chair. Before she could process the horrific scene, the killer fired again through the shattered window. Prudence was struck twice in the face, suffering catastrophic, agonizing injuries. In a display of incomprehensible, superhuman resilience, Prudence Starks did not succumb to her massive wounds. Blinded by her own blood, suffocating on terror and physical trauma, she realized that her only chance of survival was to flee. She managed to drag herself out of the house, stumbling blindly through the dark, treacherous landscape, driven entirely by the primal instinct to live. She crawled and ran until she reached the safety of a neighboring farm, desperately seeking help while the Phantom Killer melted back into the shadows from which they had emerged. Prudence survived the horrific ordeal, but the physical and emotional scars were insurmountable. The murder of Virgil Starks and the brutal attempted murder of Prudence marked a terrifying turning point. The Phantom Killer had crossed the ultimate threshold, invading the most sacred, secure space imaginable, the home. The message to the residents of Texarkana was unequivocally, terrifyingly clear. There was no safe haven, there were no boundaries, and absolutely no one was immune to the violence lurking under the moonlight. The transformation of Texarkana from a peaceful border town into a landscape of visceral fear following the attack on the Starks farmhouse was absolute and total. The psychological toll of realizing that the predator could strike at the very heart of the domestic sphere, a place previously considered the ultimate sanctuary, shattered the remaining veneer of daily normalcy. As the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The silence that descended upon the streets was no longer the peaceful quiet of a small community at rest, but a heavy, oppressive blanket of dread. Public life, commerce, and the simple pleasures of evening interaction evaporated, replaced by an urgent, frantic preoccupation with survival. The fear was not abstract or distant. It was a physical sensation that permeated every household, forcing families to confront the terrifying reality that their doors, their locks, and their thin wooden walls were entirely insufficient to keep the darkness at bay. In response to the escalating threat, a wave of defensive hysteria swept through the region, characterized by a rapid, radical militarization of the average household. Firearms, which were commonplace in this rural expanse, suddenly became the most precious commodity in town. Local hardware stores, sporting goods retailers, and even general merchant shops were besieged by citizens desperate to arm themselves. Shelves that had once held recreational supplies or hunting gear were picked clean of every available shotgun, pistol, and rifle. The atmosphere of the town changed as men and women who had never contemplated the necessity of lethal force found themselves keeping loaded weapons within arm's reach of their beds. The act of going to sleep, once a natural cycle of the day, became a calculated strategic decision, with residents obsessively checking locks and positioning themselves to defend against an intruder. The fear extended to the very infrastructure of their homes. Individuals began reinforcing their living spaces with improvised security measures. Doors were braced with heavy, rusted iron chains, windows were boarded up with planks, and some even resorted to creating crude, potentially dangerous booby traps around their property lines. It was a community under siege, fundamentally altered by the presence of an unseen enemy, and the psychological weight of this constant vigilance was exhausting. The municipal authorities, forced to grapple with a citizenry on the edge of panic, enacted drastic measures to regain a semblance of order. Official curfews were established, strictly prohibiting movement on the streets after dark. The vibrant social fabric of the Twin Cities, which had been characterized by evening drives, late-night socializing, and the innocence of teenage dating, was completely suspended. Police patrols were intensified, with officers maneuvering through the quiet streets in a state of high alert, but the reality was that they were hunting a ghost. The Phantom Killer possessed an intimate knowledge of the rural terrain, a tactical awareness that allowed them to navigate the dense woods and backroads with ease, always staying one step ahead of the law. Every shadow became a suspect, every unexplained noise in the night triggered frantic calls to the station, and the resources of the local police departments were stretched to their absolute breaking point. Recognizing that the local authorities were overwhelmed and that the danger had transcended typical crime, a massive, unprecedented multi-agency operation was launched. The Texas Rangers, an organization that occupied a near-mythical status in the American Southwest, arrived in Texarkana to take control of the investigation. Under the leadership of Captain Manuel Gonzalez, an officer who had earned the reputation of a legendary, relentless hunter of criminals, the pursuit took on a new, more aggressive intensity. Gonzalez, often referred to as the Lone Wolf, brought with him a level of discipline and systematic methodology that the community desperately craved. Joining the Rangers were agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who brought specialized techniques in evidence collection and psychological analysis to the case. This federal involvement underscored the national significance of the threat. The Phantom was no longer a local concern, but a matter of severe, cross-border urgency that had caught the attention of the highest levels of law enforcement in the country. The ensuing investigation was a monumental undertaking of sheer manual labor and analytical persistence. Hundreds of officers, deputies, and agents poured over the crime scenes, documenting every inch of the rural terrain and the isolated roads where the initial attacks had occurred. They conducted an exhaustive, grueling campaign of questioning, casting a wide net that ensnared over 400 individuals who were deemed, however loosely, to be potential suspects. Each person brought in was subjected to intense scrutiny, their histories examined, their movements tracked, and their alibis tested against the limited facts available. The jails and interrogation rooms of Texarkana were perpetually occupied as law enforcement attempted to find a single, consistent thread of evidence that could lead them to the perpetrator. Yet, the Phantom remained infuriatingly elusive. The killer had left behind remarkably little in the way of forensic evidence. There were no identifiable fingerprints, no consistent ballistic matches, and no witnesses who could provide a clear description of the assailant's face, hidden as it was beneath the infamous burlap sack. Despite the lack of concrete physical evidence, the collective gaze of the investigators and the public eventually centered on one man, Yowl Swinney. Swinney was a career criminal, a transient individual with a history of automobile theft and other petty offenses who had been operating within the region during the time of the murders. He was a man who lived on the margins, someone who blended into the transient population and possessed the nomadic, restless quality of a predator. The evidence against Swinney was largely circumstantial, a patchwork of suspicions and behavioral patterns that investigators struggled to solidify into a case that would hold up in a court of law. Among the most damning, yet legally problematic, pieces of information was the testimony provided by his own wife. She had approached authorities with claims that her husband was the person responsible for the terror, detailing events and specific actions that seemed to implicate him directly. She provided descriptions that appeared to match the clandestine, chilling actions of the Phantom Killer, painting a portrait of a man who was capable of the violence that had been inflicted upon the victims. However, the legal landscape of 1946 presented insurmountable hurdles for the prosecution. The laws regarding spousal testimony were rigid and restrictive, creating a situation where the most critical witness against Swinney could not be compelled to testify against him in a formal trial. Moreover, the wife's testimony was characterized by a disturbing, erratic inconsistency. She repeatedly offered, then retracted, then modified her statements, rendering her an unreliable witness whose accounts could not form the backbone of a murder conviction. The lack of direct physical evidence, a smoking gun, a fingerprint, or a piece of DNA-style evidence before such technology existed, left the state in a position of extreme vulnerability. They possessed a prime suspect who matched the profile of a violent, opportunistic predator, but they lacked the ironclad evidence required to secure a conviction for the most heinous of crimes. This impasse was a source of profound frustration for the law enforcement agencies and the grieving, fearful public. The pursuit of justice had become a complex, protracted legal battle where the rules of the time favored the preservation of rights over the conviction of a suspected monster. Investigators continued to dig, exploring every possibility, hoping to find that one missing piece of evidence, the discarded weapon, a matching fiber from the burlap mask, or an undeniable link between Swinney and a crime scene that would finally allow them to move forward with a prosecution. But the frustration only mounted as the weeks stretched into months, and the perpetrator continued to occupy a state of shadow-like existence, neither apprehended nor fully exonerated in the court of public opinion. Throughout this period, the pressure on the investigators was immense. They were not merely working to solve a series of crimes. They were attempting to stabilize a community that was rapidly losing its sense of security. Every day that passed without a capture was a failure that resonated with the people of Texarkana. The constant presence of the police, the checkpoints, and the public announcements served as a daily reminder of the threat. Yet, for all the resources, the expertise, and the unrelenting effort, the case remained fundamentally stalled. The investigation into the Phantom Killer served as a stark illustration of the limitations of mid-20th century criminal justice in the face of an unpredictable, highly disciplined, and elusive adversary. The case of Yowl Swinney, while compelling, ultimately highlighted the difficult chasm between moral certainty and legal proof. The investigators were left to navigate a world of shadows, chasing a phantom that refused to be captured, while the town waited, trapped in a state of limbo between the desperate hope for resolution and the paralyzing fear of the unknown. As the spring progressed, the investigation remained a relentless, grinding process, a testament to the dedication of the lawmen but also a grim reminder of how easily a predator could slip through the grasp of even the most determined authorities. The mystery continued to deepen, with each unanswered question fueling the collective anxiety of the region and ensuring that the name of the Phantom Killer would be etched into the local consciousness for generations to come, not as a name known to justice, but as a legend of terror that remained, quite literally, beyond the light of accountability. The investigative efforts during the late spring of 1946 reached a level of intensity that remains virtually unparalleled in the history of regional law enforcement. As the search for the Phantom Killer expanded, the procedural rigor applied by the Texas Rangers and the FBI became a masterclass in the desperation and logistical complexity of mid-century criminal investigation. Every element of the case was treated with extreme urgency, as the specter of another attack loomed over the investigators like a physical weight. The strategy was two-pronged: a relentless, sweeping dragnet designed to flush out any individual fitting the perpetrator's profile, and a microscopic, forensic-style analysis of the crime scenes that, despite the primitive nature of the period's technology, sought to squeeze every possible insight from the sparse evidence available. The interrogation process was the centerpiece of the operation, a grueling sequence that stretched across weeks and involved hundreds of individuals. This was not a passive observation. It was a proactive, often aggressive attempt to break the mystery through sheer human volume. Officers and agents operated out of makeshift command centers, sorting through thousands of pages of interviews, logs of suspicious activity, and files on every known transient or resident with a history of violent behavior. The criteria for being considered a suspect were necessarily broad given the lack of specific identifying features. Any man in the region who possessed a motive, however vague, or who could not account for his whereabouts during the hours of the attacks, was brought in for questioning. The atmosphere in these rooms was thick with the tension of the era, the sharp light of interrogation lamps casting long, harsh shadows that seemed to mirror the very mystery they were trying to solve. Captain Manuel Gonzalez brought a unique, almost proprietary approach to the investigation. Known for his tactical brilliance and his unshakable commitment to the duty of the Rangers, he was instrumental in coordinating the multi-agency response. His presence was not just administrative, it was symbolic, representing the state's refusal to allow a criminal to dictate the terms of their existence. Under his guidance, the investigation began to move beyond simple questioning and into the realm of organized intelligence gathering. They mapped the attacks with mathematical precision, looking for patterns in the geography, the timing, and the victimology. The goal was to identify the logic, however depraved, that the Phantom was following. They analyzed the choice of locations, the movement between the Texas and Arkansas jurisdictions, and the progression from random roadside assault to the targeted, home-based violence of the Starks incident. The evidentiary process, while constrained by the limitations of 1946, was nevertheless exhaustive. Investigators combed through the underbrush of the lovers' lanes, searching for anything: a discarded piece of clothing, a shell casing, a partial footprint that might point toward the assailant. The specific weapon or weapons used were a major focus of ballistic analysis. By attempting to match the caliber and firing patterns of the recovered evidence, the forensic teams hoped to establish a single, unified source for the violence. They interviewed survivors with a delicate, persistent precision, attempting to extract the smallest details from the trauma of the attacks. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, as well as the severely wounded Prudence Starks, were questioned repeatedly. Each testimony was a precious, fragile record, as law enforcement tried to build a picture of the killer that went beyond the crude, terrifying facade of the burlap mask. The challenge was that each survivor's recollection was filtered through the lens of unimaginable fear, making it difficult to differentiate between certain observations and the reflexive, defensive responses of a panicked mind. The investigation also took on a significant psychological dimension. FBI agents began to construct a profile of the perpetrator, characterizing them as a highly adaptable, locally knowledgeable, and deeply pathological individual. This was a nascent form of profiling, far removed from modern behavioral science, but it provided a necessary framework for the task force. They hypothesized that the killer was not a stranger passing through, but someone with deep roots in the Texarkana area, someone who could blend into the community by day and transform into a monster by night. This realization changed the nature of the suspect pool. It made the quiet, neighborly facade of the town suspect. Every citizen was now a potential witness or a potential culprit, which deepened the sense of mutual suspicion that had already begun to infect the town's social life. The central figure in the investigation, Yowell Swinney, became the target of an increasingly desperate attempt to force a breakthrough. He was a man who seemed to embody the darker, untraceable side of the region's population. His history of car theft made him a prime candidate for the mobile nature of the crimes, as the Phantom had clearly relied on a vehicle to navigate the vast, dark outskirts of the county. The circumstantial evidence against him was built piece by piece, an accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details that, taken together, painted a highly suspicious picture. His whereabouts at the time of the killings, his relationship with his wife, and his own evasive, often contradictory responses during interrogations provided the investigators with the leverage they needed to maintain his detention. Yet, every step toward a breakthrough was met with an insurmountable wall of legal and evidentiary failure. The judicial standards of the time regarding the admissibility of testimony, the protection of the marital privilege, and the requirements for physical proof of guilt were absolute barriers. The task force was forced to navigate a legal labyrinth that often seemed to protect the suspect more effectively than the community. Every time an agent thought they were close to a definitive link, the path would lead to a dead end. The frustration of the investigators was visceral. They could see the predator, they could track his movements through the evidence, but they could not grasp him. The case of the Phantom Killer was, in many ways, an exercise in the profound limitation of human agency against a well-hidden, disciplined adversary. The investigation was also deeply affected by the mounting pressure from the press and the public. Journalists from across the region swarmed the area, creating a secondary, chaotic layer of narrative that often outpaced the actual investigative progress. Rumors, conspiracy theories, and premature conclusions were disseminated in the morning papers, fueling the already frantic state of the citizenry. The law enforcement officials had to manage this external pressure while remaining focused on the slow, methodical process of the law. They were fighting a war on two fronts: the internal battle to find the killer and the external battle to maintain social order in the face of intense, unyielding scrutiny. The complexity of the jurisdictional divide between Texas and Arkansas further hindered the investigation. While the Rangers and the FBI provided a federal and state level of cooperation, the realities of local law enforcement meant that communication gaps and procedural conflicts were inevitable. Sharing evidence, synchronizing timelines, and ensuring that no stone was left unturned required a level of administrative coordination that was difficult to achieve in the chaos of a town in crisis. Despite these obstacles, the dedication shown by the individual officers was consistent and unflagging. They were driven by the human cost of the crimes, the memory of Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, and the tragic, permanent injury of the survivors. As the spring turned toward summer, the realization began to set in that the immediate, high-stakes phase of the investigation was coming to a natural, if unsatisfying, conclusion. The momentum of the serial killings had ceased, as if the perpetrator had simply chosen to walk away, having achieved some unknown objective or sensing that the dragnet was tightening too dangerously. The investigation didn't so much end as it gradually faded, losing the intense energy of the active manhunt and transitioning into the cold, long-term dormancy of a perpetual cold case. The investigators were left with boxes of evidence, thousands of pages of reports, and the haunting, unanswered question of who had worn the burlap mask. The process, for all its intensity and sophistication, had failed to bring the Phantom Killer to justice. It remained a testament to the persistent, often futile nature of the search for truth in the aftermath of irrational, senseless violence. The final reports were filed, the patrols were reduced, and the town of Texarkana began the slow, painful process of healing, although the identity of the monster who had terrorized their nights remained, and would likely forever remain, a shadow in the archives of their history. The transition from an active, high-intensity investigation to the cold reality of a legal impasse was a grueling process for the authorities tasked with solving the Texarkana moonlight murders. As the summer of 1946 arrived, the immediate panic that had once gripped the streets began to subside, replaced by a lingering, dull ache of uncertainty. The investigation, which had once felt like a race against an unstoppable force, had effectively reached a stalemate, leaving the legal system to grapple with the complexities of a case that defied easy categorization. The focus of the authorities, and consequently the attention of the courts, shifted from the urgent pursuit of an active killer to the long-term, frustrating reality of building a case against Yowl Swinney. The courthouse in Texarkana became the arena where the collective desire for justice collided with the rigid, unforgiving requirements of the American legal framework of the mid-40s. Yowl Swinney sat at the center of this legal drama, a figure whose presence in the courtroom was both a necessity and a disappointment to those who had hoped for a clear, decisive victory over the terror. The prosecution was tasked with the formidable burden of connecting Swinney not just to the general environment of the crime, but specifically to the acts of murder and assault that had defined the Phantom Killer. The legal challenge was twofold. First, they had to establish a narrative that could explain the perpetrator's sudden onset and eventual cessation of violence, and second, they had to anchor that narrative in evidence that met the high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's strategy was to rely heavily on the testimony provided by Swinney's wife, who had been the original source of the allegations that had turned the spotlight on him. However, the trial immediately encountered significant, systemic obstacles regarding the role of spousal testimony. The legal environment of that era offered distinct protections to the sanctity of marriage, including rules that largely prevented one spouse from being compelled to testify against the other in matters of criminal prosecution. This principle, while designed to protect family relationships, acted as a protective shield for the suspect. The prosecution team, led by determined district attorneys who were acutely aware of the public outcry for resolution, spent countless hours attempting to navigate these procedural hurdles. They sought to introduce the wife's earlier, voluntary statements into the record, arguing that they provided a detailed, inside account of the crimes that only a participant or a close confidant could possess. These statements, if admitted and believed by a jury, would have been devastating, potentially providing the missing link that connected Swinney to the specific locations and methods of the attacks. However, the defense mounted a vigorous and effective counterstrategy. They challenged the reliability of the testimony, highlighting the erratic behavior and changing stories of the witness. They painted a portrait of a woman who was perhaps pressured by law enforcement, or who was motivated by her own personal vendettas, rather than by an objective desire to see justice served. The inconsistency of her narrative was the defense's strongest weapon. By successfully casting doubt on her credibility, they created the necessary space for reasonable doubt, a space that the law mandated be filled in the defendant's favor. The trial was a series of tactical maneuvers where each side presented their interpretation of the facts. The prosecution laid out the timeline, the forensic indicators, and the behavioral profile that pointed toward Swinney, while the defense dismantled each piece, presenting alternative explanations that appeared plausible in the absence of absolute physical proof. The climax of the legal proceedings did not result in the dramatic verdict that the community had envisioned. The prosecution realized that without the consistent, admissible testimony of the wife, their case for murder was tragically fragile. The lack of a smoking gun, a recovered murder weapon, a forensic match, or an undeniable confession meant that they were fighting a battle with tied hands. The legal reality was stark. They could hold Swinney, they could keep him in the system, but they could not definitively prove he was the Phantom. Instead of risking an acquittal on the murder charges, which would have been a final, crushing blow to the families of the victims, the state chose a strategic, if deeply frustrating, compromise. They pursued the charges related to his known history of criminal activity, specifically the theft of automobiles and other associated crimes. The trial for the automobile theft charge became the final act in the formal legal response to the Phantom Killer. It was a somber, serious affair, stripped of the sensationalism that had surrounded the earlier, more terrifying days of the investigation. The prosecution presented the evidence of the thefts, linking Swinney to the stolen vehicles that had been used during the commission of his crimes. The defense did not contest the criminality of these actions as effectively as they had the murder charges, and the jury, presented with a clear record of his criminal history and the evidence of his habitual offender status, reached a verdict that was both final and limited in its scope. Swinney was sentenced to a term of life imprisonment, a decision that ensured he would be removed from society, but which left the central, burning question of the serial killings officially unresolved. The atmosphere in the courtroom when the sentence was passed was one of mixed emotions. There was a sense of grim satisfaction that the system had managed to secure a conviction, ensuring that Swinney would not walk free, but there was also a profound, underlying sense of incompleteness. The families of the victims, who had sat through every day of the proceedings, had come seeking not just a conviction, but an acknowledgement, a definitive answer to why their loved ones had been targeted and who had been responsible. The sentencing of Swinney to life for car theft felt like an anticlimax, a procedural resolution to a tragedy that had demanded a moral one. The district attorney and the investigators, despite their best efforts, were forced to accept that the formal legal process had reached its terminus, regardless of the fact that the primary mystery remained shrouded in ambiguity. The repercussions of this outcome were felt far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The inability of the legal system to secure a conviction for the murders meant that the label of phantom killer remained a haunting, spectral title for an individual who had officially escaped the reach of the law. For the remainder of his life in prison, and until his release in 1973, Yowell Swinney remained the primary subject of speculation, a man who the investigators believed to be guilty, but whom the court could not convict. This created a lasting, shadow-like quality to his status in the public imagination. He was the man who was held accountable for his crimes, but not for the ones that had broken the spirit of the town. The process of the trial had been a necessary, yet exhausting, exertion of the law. It had served to document the crimes, to validate the experiences of the survivors, and to ensure that the perpetrator was at least partially held to account. However, it also served as a stark reminder of the limitations of the courtroom. The law is designed to operate on the basis of evidence and procedure, not on the fulfillment of communal closure. The trial demonstrated that in the wake of such extreme, irrational violence, the legal process can provide order, but it cannot always provide the definitive truth that a community craves. The case against Swinney was closed in the eyes of the law, but it remained wide open in the hearts of those who lived in the shadow of the Texarkana moonlight murders. The final verdict, while not the one many had hoped for, did provide the only measure of justice that could be achieved under the circumstances. The community of Texarkana began to move forward, the fear that had dictated their lives during that spring of '46 slowly receding into the background of their collective memory. The case became a reference point, a historical marker of a time when the darkness had been a very real, very lethal threat. The conclusion of the trial did not wipe away the pain or the questions, but it did provide a definitive end to the immediate crisis. The phantom had been silenced, removed from the equation, and though the identity of the monster would forever be a subject of debate, the town was finally free to begin the long, slow work of reclaiming the night, looking back at the events not as an ongoing threat, but as a tragic, foundational chapter in their shared history. The legal chapter had concluded, but the legacy of the phantom remained, etched permanently into the story of the border town that had once dared to dream of peace and had found, instead, the darkest of realities. The conclusion of the legal proceedings against Yowell Swinney in the summer of 1946 did not signify the end of the psychological impact that the Texarkana moonlight murders had etched into the town's collective consciousness. While the immediate, acute terror of the stalking predator began to wane as the attacks ceased, the legacy of that spring remained a permanent, haunting feature of the border town's identity. The trauma, characterized by the absolute violation of the sanctuary of home and the sudden, violent erasure of young lives, was not something that could be simply filed away in a police archive or resolved by a prison sentence for car theft. Instead, it transformed into a generational ghost story, a dark, foundational myth that defined the very atmosphere of the region. The silence that had once been mandated by the fear of the phantom now became the quietude of a community processing an experience that defied standard human explanation. For those who had survived the attacks, the shadow of the burlap mask remained an ever-present, internal specter. They were forced to navigate a world that had fundamentally changed, where the simple act of driving down a rural road at night or sitting in one's own living room carried with it the echo of a traumatic past. The societal shift was profound. The carefree innocence of youth in Texarkana was irrevocably lost, replaced by a cautious, guarded outlook on the environment and the people within it. The event had acted as a catalyst for a permanent change in how the community viewed its own safety, its own vulnerability, and the potential for evil to manifest in the most mundane of places. The long-term impact on the town was most clearly seen in the way it remembered the victims. Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin, and Betty Jo Booker were not merely names on a police report. They became symbols of a lost normalcy, their lives cut short in a manner so sudden and brutal that it forced the town to confront the fragility of existence. The memory of their loss served as a continuous, somber reminder of the events of that spring, a persistent thread in the narrative of the region. The survivors, who carried the physical and mental scars of their encounters, were the living witnesses to a darkness that most could only imagine. Their stories, often kept within the confines of their immediate families, served as a private, ongoing struggle against the lingering effects of their trauma. As the years passed, the specific details of the investigation began to blur into a composite, legendary account, but the core essence of the fear remained as sharp as ever. The cultural and artistic reverberations of the Texarkana case extended far beyond the local borders, eventually embedding itself into the wider American horror tradition. The specific, visceral imagery of the crimes, the isolation of the lovers' lanes, the sudden, mechanical cruelty of the violence, and the iconic, deeply terrifying burlap mask resonated with filmmakers and storytellers who sought to capture the essence of existential dread. In 1976, the release of the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown acted as a definitive act of public commemoration and exploration of the tragedy. By dramatizing the events, the film brought the story of the Phantom Killer to a national audience, cementing the case's status in the annals of true crime. The film served a dual purpose. It was both a cinematic exploration of horror and a historical marker, ensuring that the events of 1946 would not be lost to the passage of time. The success of this film, and its subsequent influence on the slasher genre, demonstrated the enduring power of the story. The Phantom had become an archetype of the hidden, faceless threat, a precursor to the masked slashers that would define decades of horror cinema. It is a sobering irony that a real-life tragedy of such magnitude served as the blueprint for the very fictional monsters that would later dominate the genre. However, the enduring mystery surrounding the identity of the Phantom Killer was perhaps the most significant aspect of the case's legacy. The lack of a definitive resolution created a void that encouraged speculation, investigation, and endless debate. Amateur sleuths, historians, and true crime enthusiasts continued to pore over the archives long after the primary investigations had concluded, seeking that one missing piece of evidence or that one overlooked detail that could finally identify the predator. The persistent nature of this inquiry highlighted the human need for closure, the deeply ingrained desire to name the monster and understand the motivation behind the irrational. In the absence of an answer, the mystery itself became the story, an enigma that stood as a testament to the fact that some events in human history remain fundamentally beyond our understanding. The Phantom was never caught, and in that failure, the mystery achieved a kind of immortality. The reflection on the Texarkana Moonlight murders is, at its core, a reflection on the nature of evil and the limits of human knowledge. The events of that spring were a rupture in the expected order of life, a brief, terrifying exposure to the potential for senseless, targeted violence in a small community. The failure of the system to definitively catch the perpetrator, despite the immense resources and effort, forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that justice is not always served in the way we desire. The legacy of the Phantom is one of unanswered questions and lingering doubt. It serves as a reminder that safety is a fragile concept, easily shattered by the actions of an individual operating entirely outside the boundaries of social and moral norms. The town of Texarkana, which had once been defined by its unique geographic split, found itself defined by this collective experience, a shared history of fear, resilience, and the enduring search for truth. Ultimately, the story of the Phantom Killer is not just about the murders or the investigation. It is about the resilience of a community in the face of an existential threat. It is about how a town, having been brought to the brink by an unseen monster, managed to piece itself back together and continue to function. The fear that once governed the streets was eventually replaced by the persistence of daily life, but the experience left a permanent imprint. The legacy of the Phantom is a story of how a community deals with the shadows, how it remembers those who are lost, and how it continues to move forward despite the haunting absence of closure. The mystery of the burlap-masked killer will likely never be fully solved, but that fact only serves to emphasize the depth of the tragedy. It is a story that remains, in the quiet corners of the history of the American Southwest, a persistent reminder of the darkness that can exist beneath the moonlight and the long, enduring struggle to bring such darkness into the light of understanding. The case has moved from the headlines of the 1940s into the cultural lexicon, serving as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of the innocent and the terrifying, persistent nature of the unknown. As we look back on the events, we are not just examining a criminal case. We are examining the limits of justice, the persistence of memory, and the ways in which a community grapples with the inexplicable. The Phantom Killer remains a legend, a ghost in the records, a permanent, unresolved question that will continue to challenge our understanding of history and the complexities of human nature for as long as the story is told. The town that once dreaded sundown has learned to live with the memory of the shadow, but it has not forgotten the cost of the peace it had to struggle so hard to reclaim. Through the film, through the ongoing research, and through the oral histories passed down within the families of Texarkana, the story remains alive, a testament to the fact that the impact of a crime of this nature is not limited by time or by the resolution of the legal process. The mystery persists, the fear has evolved, but the memory remains as fixed as the stars under which the predator once hunted, a dark, silent chapter in the story of the American experience, forever waiting for the light of truth that may never fully illuminate the truth behind the burlap mask. The finality of the case of the Phantom Killer resides not in the cold, hard conclusion of a courtroom verdict, but in the enduring, atmospheric shadow it casts over the landscape of true crime history. To look back at Texarkana in the 1940s is to observe a society in the process of defining its own resilience against a threat that refused to conform to the rational expectations of the era. The investigation, for all its structural failures and legal limitations, succeeded in documenting a moment where the American dream of post-war prosperity was violently interrupted by the specter of pure, unadulterated malice. The legacy of these events is woven into the geography of the Twin Cities, where the quiet, rural roads that once hosted the terror have been paved over or transformed by the passage of time, yet the memory of the burlap-masked figure remains as a persistent, unsettling ghost. This is a story that has transcended the boundaries of a simple criminal investigation, evolving into a foundational myth that speaks to the deeper anxieties of the human condition. When we examine the aftermath, we are forced to confront the reality that some questions are never meant to be answered, and that some monsters are destined to remain perpetually elusive, existing in the space between historical fact and the terrifying narratives of folklore. The persistence of this mystery is perhaps the most profound testament to the scale of the trauma experienced by the community. Even as the years turned into decades and the original witnesses and investigators passed away, the story of the Phantom Killer was kept alive by the families of the victims and the collective memory of the townsfolk. It became a story passed down through generations, a cautionary tale that served to remind the living of the fragility of safety. In every dark, secluded corner of the rural South, the ghost of the Texarkana murderer seems to linger, a reminder that the darkness is never truly conquered, only managed. This cultural retention is what gives the case its enduring, haunting power. It is not just the brutality of the crimes that fascinates, but the sheer, frustrating persistence of the anonymity. The fact that the killer could walk among the populace, participate in the routine of daily life, and yet remain completely unseen by the law is a notion that continues to unsettle the modern mind, which expects that technology and systematic inquiry will eventually unveil the truth. As we consider the broader impact of this tragedy on the American landscape, we must recognize that the Phantom Killer became an archetype for the vulnerability of the domestic sphere. The transition from attacking unsuspecting couples in their relative isolation of the countryside to the cold-blooded, targeted invasion of a private farmhouse marked a terrifying escalation that forever altered the relationship between the citizen and their home. The sense of security that had previously been taken for granted was revealed to be a fragile construct, easily dismantled by a single individual with a plan and a weapon. This shift in perception was universal. It resonated with a public that was beginning to move into an era of suburban expansion and a greater focus on domestic privacy. The idea that the most sacred, private spaces of our lives could be targeted by a faceless, external threat became a pervasive undercurrent of fear that has influenced, consciously or unconsciously, the way we design our homes, our communities, and our perceptions of public safety. The role of the media in shaping the legacy of the Phantom Killer cannot be overstated. From the moment the first reports hit the wires in the spring of 1946, the case was framed by a narrative of suspense and escalating terror. The press played a dual role, acting as both an essential conduit of information and a source of the very panic that the authorities were struggling to contain. The sensationalized headlines, the graphic descriptions of the crime scenes, and the constant, breathless updates on the progress of the manhunt ensured that the story reached every corner of the country. This early, intense media coverage set the stage for the later, more structured explorations of the case in film and literature. It established the Phantom as a figure of national intrigue, a character that could be endlessly analyzed and reimagined. In this way, the killer was granted a form of immortality that transcended the biological reality of the individual. They became a symbol of the unknown, a Rorschach test for our collective fears about what hides in the shadows of our own neighborhoods. The evolution of the true crime genre itself owes a significant debt to the Texarkana case. As one of the first truly sensational serial killer investigations in the post-war era, it provided a blueprint for how such cases were to be documented, discussed, and remembered. The tropes that we now take for granted, the profile of the killer, the timeline of the violence, the analysis of the psychological motive, were all, in their embryonic stages, present in the frantic, disorganized, yet determined efforts of the Texarkana investigators. The case established the parameters for how society processes the trauma of serial violence. It taught us that we need stories, that we need to narrate the horror in order to begin to understand it, and that we will never be fully satisfied with the answer unless it comes in the form of a clear, definitive capture. The lack of that definitive ending has only fueled the genre, driving researchers to continue digging, to continue questioning, and to continue hoping that the light of truth might one day find the hidden corners of this case. Moreover, the psychological toll on the investigators themselves, those men who worked the beat, who sat in the interrogation rooms, and who lived with the frustration of the unresolved case, is a facet of the story that is often overlooked in favor of the more sensational elements. Theirs was a burden of duty that was never quite satisfied. To chase a killer, to dedicate one's life and professional energy to the pursuit of justice, and to fall short at the finish line is a unique form of professional and personal tragedy. The Texas Rangers, the FBI, and the local officers all left a piece of their humanity in that investigation. Their reports, their notes, and their haunting memories are the only remnants of the effort, a paper trail of a battle that was fought with conviction, but left without a victor. We must honor that persistence, recognizing that the failures of the legal process were not failures of effort, but rather a reflection of the inherent, often overwhelming difficulty of the task. In the final assessment, the story of the Phantom Killer is a mirror held up to our own understanding of justice. It challenges our belief in the efficacy of the law, our trust in the safety of our environments, and our capacity to reconcile with the existence of pure, unprovoked violence. It is a story that refuses to be neatly tucked away, demanding instead that we grapple with the uncomfortable truth that some questions remain open. The burlap mask, once a tool of terror, has become a symbol for the limitations of our knowledge, an icon that represents everything we cannot see and everything we cannot name. To continue to tell the story of Texarkana is to acknowledge that we are all, in some measure, living in the shadow of the unknown. We look to the past to understand the present, And in the case of the Phantom Killer, we find that the past is not a static point in history, but a living, breathing narrative that continues to evolve, to haunt, and to challenge us. As the years continue to pass, the details of the 1946 spring may fade into the archives of time, but the impression left by the Phantom will remain. The story has been integrated into the cultural lexicon, standing alongside other great, unresolved mysteries of the American experience. It is a tale that reminds us to be vigilant, to cherish the moments of peace we have, and to recognize that the darkness is never far away. It asks us to consider what we would do if faced with a similar terror, and in that moment of reflection, we are all, in some small way, transported back to that border town where the sun was feared, where the night was a battlefield, and where the Phantom left behind a legacy that would echo for generations to come. The investigation may have ended, the trials may have concluded, and the participants may have long since departed, but the Phantom persists. He is in the silence of the woods, in the darkness of the country road, and in the persistent, gnawing doubt that lingers at the back of our minds whenever we find ourselves alone in the quiet of the night. This is the ultimate, enduring truth of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. They are a part of our history, a stain upon the fabric of our shared memory, and a reminder that, despite all our progress, some things remain forever beyond our grasp. The story reaches its conclusion here, not because the mystery is solved, but because the narrative has reached its natural, inevitable point of reflection, leaving us to contemplate the phantom that walks in the shadows of the past, forever waiting for the light that will never truly reveal the face beneath the burlap, a permanent, unresolved element in the great, unfolding story of humanity. The resonance of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders persists not because of the cruelty of the acts, but because the identity of the perpetrator remains a void in the historical record, a vacuum that continues to draw in speculation and inquiry even 8 decades later. As we navigate the complex legacy of this case, we are forced to grapple with the realization that the pursuit of truth is not always linear, nor is it always rewarded with a definitive conclusion. The Phantom, having successfully evaded the grasp of the Texas Rangers and the FBI during the peak of their investigative powers, has achieved a sort of dark immortality. By stripping away the possibility of a definitive capture, the killer denied the community the catharsis of a public trial and the closure of a final, official judgment. This ambiguity serves as the foundational element of the case's modern resonance, transforming it from a specific set of criminal events into a perennial mystery that haunts the consciousness of the region. The lessons learned from the failure to identify the suspect continue to inform our understanding of criminal justice, emphasizing the fragility of evidence and the limitations of forensic methodology when applied to a highly disciplined, opportunistic adversary. The long-term social evolution of Texarkana can be viewed as a direct response to this unresolved trauma. The town, having once been forced to adapt to a state of perpetual, enforced vigilance, slowly integrated the experience of the 1940s into its cultural fabric. The memory of the murders became a touchstone for the region, a shared understanding of the depth of human potential for irrational malice. This collective memory serves a vital function, acting as a historical anchor that connects the present community to the trials of their predecessors. The stories passed down through generations are not merely retellings of a gruesome crime. They are narratives of resilience, detailing how a community, when faced with an existential threat that defied their comprehension, managed to endure and persist. The act of remembering is, in itself, an act of reclaiming power over the experience, transforming the vulnerability of the victims into an enduring testament of communal strength. As the decades have progressed, the advancements in forensic science and psychological profiling have inevitably turned their gaze toward the cold case files of Texarkana. The prospect of applying modern DNA technology or advanced behavioral analysis to the remnants of the 1940s investigation is a subject of constant debate among amateur researchers and professionals alike. The hope remains that some piece of physical evidence, stored in an archive for nearly 80 years, might finally offer the definitive link to the Phantom Killer. Yet, this pursuit is tempered by the reality of time. The degradation of physical evidence, The passing of key witnesses and suspects and the limitations of the original forensic protocols create significant hurdles that make a modern resolution increasingly unlikely. This realization does not deter the search, however. Rather, it amplifies the mystery, turning the case into an intellectual challenge that pushes the boundaries of what is possible in the field of historical forensics. The role of the case in the development of the true crime genre is a theme that warrants ongoing reflection. By documenting the investigation through the lens of systematic inquiry, the Texarkana case provided a foundation for the structures we now see in modern crime reporting and storytelling. It taught us to value the chronology of the events, the details of the crime scenes, and the importance of the victim's perspective. It highlighted the tension between the desire for an immediate, sensational resolution and the slow, often tedious process of effective law enforcement. This case remains a point of reference for those who study the evolution of serial killer narratives, serving as an early example of how a singular series of crimes can fundamentally shift the social, cultural, and even the architectural landscape of a community. The influence is clear in the ways in which the story of the Phantom has been processed through the mediums of film, literature, and even digital archives, each iteration adding a new layer of interpretation to the original facts. Reflecting on the limitations of the legal system during the initial investigation allows for a more nuanced understanding of the challenges faced by the authorities of the time. The jurisdictional complexities, the nascent stage of federal involvement in local criminal investigations, and the rigid application of legal protocols created a situation where the pursuit of justice was often at odds with the demands of administrative and procedural order. The trial of Yowell Swinney, while failing to secure a conviction for the murders, served as an essential exercise in accountability, documenting the suspect's history and providing a venue for the state to formally articulate its case. While the outcome may have felt insufficient, the legal process provided a necessary structure for the town's transition from crisis to recovery. It is a reminder that the law, while not always providing the moral certainty we seek, is an essential framework for navigating the aftermath of human tragedy. The psychological dimension of the case, the fear experienced by the residents, the trauma endured by the survivors, and the persistent anxiety that define the daily lives of the citizenry, remains perhaps the most significant aspect of the narrative. To truly understand the Texarkana Moonlight murders, one must empathize with the people who lived through that spring. The experience was not merely a series of incidents, it was a complete reconfiguration of their lived environment. The darkness, which had previously been a benign feature of the landscape, became a source of immediate, tangible danger. The fear was a pervasive, inescapable presence that required a constant, exhausting level of alertness. Recognizing this reality is essential for any honest account of the case, as it highlights the human cost of the violence and the immense courage required to persist in the face of such overwhelming terror. As we bring this reflection on the Texarkana Moonlight murders to a close, it is clear that the case remains a defining moment in the history of the American borderland. The Phantom, whose name and face are lost to time, persists as a permanent fixture in the collective narrative of the region. The mystery serves as a constant, subtle reminder that the world is more complex, more volatile, and more capable of inexplicable violence than we often choose to believe. The story of the town that once dreaded sundown is a narrative of human fragility and the persistent search for truth in the aftermath of the unknown. It is a story that refuses to conclude, instead evolving with each new generation that encounters it. The burlap mask, a symbol of the faceless predator, has become an enduring icon of the limit of our knowledge, an enigma that continues to challenge our perception of justice and the nature of the monsters that walk among us. In the end, the Texarkana case is not just about the failures of the past, but about the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with the dark, silent realities of history. It remains a case that invites us to look closer, to question more, and to hold onto the memory of those whose lives were taken, ensuring that their names are not forgotten even as the identity of their killer remains forever shrouded in the persistent, unchanging, and deeply unsettling darkness of the Texas and Arkansas night. The Phantom lives on, not in the flesh, but in the echoes of a mystery that continues to challenge the boundaries of time, memory, and the search for absolute truth, leaving us to forever contemplate the shadows of a border town that was changed irrevocably and for all time by a spring of terror that we still, despite all our progress, cannot fully comprehend. The persistence of the Texarkana Moonlight murders as an unsolved enigma is not merely a failure of forensic science or legal rigor, but a profound demonstration of the limitations of historical documentation when confronted with the irrationality of pure violence. As we reach the final contemplative horizon of this chronicle, it becomes evident that the Phantom Killer has evolved beyond the category of a criminal suspect and into the realm of a cultural archetype. The void left by the absence of an identified perpetrator allowed the residents of the Twin Cities to project their deepest anxieties onto the faceless assailant, transforming a series of horrific, localized crimes into a universal narrative about the encroachment of evil upon the mundane. This evolution from reality to legend is the mechanism by which communities process tragedy that is too vast or too senseless to be addressed by standard judicial protocols. By holding the phantom in the collective memory, the people of Texarkana have effectively preserved the warning that the darkness is never truly static and that the order we impose upon our lives is a fragile construct that can be dismantled in an instant. The investigative files, now yellowed and fragmented by time, offer only a static snapshot of a crisis that was, in its essence, highly fluid and unpredictable. The frustration experienced by those who worked the case remains palpable in the archives. Their notes reveal a desperate, methodical attempt to impose logic on a series of events that possessed none. We can see the evolution of their strategies, from the initial, hopeful reliance on traditional police work to the later, more desperate mobilization of multi-agency task forces. Each document is a testament to the dedicated labor of men who were driven by the moral imperative to deliver justice, even as they encountered one dead end after another. The failure to secure a conviction, while objectively a procedural shortfall, should not diminish the immense moral weight of their endeavor. Their persistence in the face of such a terrifying and elusive opponent remains a high-water mark for regional law enforcement, a benchmark for the commitment required when the social contract is under fire. The transformation of the town's social life during those months of terror serves as an essential case study in the sociology of fear. The enforced curfews, the rapid arming of the citizenry, and the total cessation of nocturnal activity represent a rare, documented instance of a community operating under the extreme duress of an unknown threat. This was not a panic driven by war or natural disaster, but by the focused, tactical violence of a single entity. The change in the town's daily rhythm was total, reflecting a fundamental shift in the psychological baseline of every inhabitant. When the violence ceased, the return to normalcy was not an erasure of the trauma, but a slow, often painful integration of the experience into the town's shared history. The legacy of the Phantom is visible in the cautiousness that was passed down through generations, an inherited understanding that the night possesses a different, more dangerous character than the day. Looking back, we must also acknowledge the role of the environment itself as a silent witness to the carnage. The rural outskirts, the marshland borders, and the secluded lovers' lanes of 1946 were more than mere settings. They were the tactical terrain that favored the predator and confounded the law. The geographic unique positioning of Texarkana, a town bisected by a state line, created a complex jurisdictional landscape that undoubtedly hindered the synchronization of the investigation. The shadow of the law was often fragmented, and the perpetrator utilized this to maintain their anonymity, crossing borders as easily as they crossed the line between the victim's safety and their destruction. This geographic reality is a crucial element of the mystery, underscoring the logistical nightmares that law enforcement faced in their attempt to corral a shadow that knew the terrain better than those who were tasked with patrolling it. The long-term impact on the families of the victims is a facet of the story that requires the utmost empathy and solemnity. For them, the Phantom Killer was not a legend or a cinematic figure. He was the source of a permanent, irreparable hole in their lives. The void left by the murder of their loved ones was compounded by the failure of the justice system to provide a definitive answer. This lack of resolution meant that their grief could never be neatly processed or filed away. It remained an open wound, an ongoing absence that was reinforced by the persistent public discourse surrounding the mystery. Their resilience in the face of this systemic disappointment is a testament to the profound strength of the human spirit, even when the institutions designed to protect and serve fail to deliver the expected closure. The memory of Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, and Betty Jo Booker remains the true heart of the narrative, the reason why the story must be told with accuracy, reverence, and a deep commitment to the truth of their experiences. The evolution of the true crime genre, fueled by the fascination with the unsolved, often risks romanticizing the violence or stripping the victims of their humanity. We must guard against this tendency, ensuring that the focus remains on the reality of the harm caused and the genuine, persistent trauma inflicted upon the community. The story of the Phantom Killer is not a piece of entertainment to be consumed, but a historical trauma to be analyzed and respected. As we reflect on the case, we recognize that the horror lies in the mundane nature of the attacks, the simple evening drive, the reading of a newspaper in a private home, that were so brutally and decisively interrupted. This is the ultimate lesson of the Texarkana case, that the most horrific acts can take place in the most ordinary of circumstances, and that our sense of security is often an illusion that we maintain to navigate a world that is inherently unpredictable and, at times, violently indifferent. In the final estimation, the Phantom Killer remains a spectral presence in the history of the American Southwest. The mystery of his identity will continue to be debated, the archives will continue to be scoured, and the legend will continue to be retold, ensuring that the burlap-masked assailant is never entirely erased from the public consciousness. Yet, as we close this exhaustive review of the events, we find that the mystery has not been solved, but rather deepened. We are left with a clearer understanding of the complexity of the crime, the limitations of the investigation, and the endurance of the community, but we are no closer to the truth of who wore the mask. This is the final, unyielding reality of the Texarkana case. It stands as a permanent reminder of the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the law and the lawless, and between the history we document and the shadows that remain forever outside our reach. The memory of the spring of '46 is now a legacy that belongs to the town and to the records of criminal history, a chapter that is as much about the persistence of fear as it is about the resilience of humanity. We leave the case here, not because there is nothing left to say, but because we have reached the furthest point of historical clarity. The rest is speculation, the rest is folklore, and the rest is the echo of a phantom that walked the border roads long ago, leaving behind a scar that time has softened but never fully removed. The story of the town that once dreaded the sundown is the story of a struggle that is both uniquely local and universally significant, a narrative that serves as a permanent anchor in the history of the American experience, reminding us that we must always be mindful of the shadows and always prepared to confront the darkness, even when we know that some of it may never be brought fully into the light. The mask remains, the mystery holds, and the phantom lingers, a silent, permanent figure in the landscape of our shared, unresolved history. The conclusion of this extensive examination of the Texarkana Moonlight murders brings us to a final, somber realization that the true horror of the case does not lie solely in the acts of violence committed during that fateful spring, but in the enduring silence that followed. The Phantom, having successfully occupied the consciousness of a nation for decades, exists now as a permanent artifact of American criminal lore. We have traversed the landscape of the 1940s, analyzed the investigative bottlenecks, scrutinized the legal limitations, and contemplated the sociological scars left upon a community that was forever altered. Yet, at the end of this journey, we find ourselves back at the beginning, staring into the abyss of the unknown, faced with the same questions that plagued the investigators in the immediate aftermath of the Starks attack. The burlap-masked figure, though long gone from the physical roads of Texas and Arkansas, remains a hauntingly present entity in the historical record, a ghost that refuses to be quieted or forgotten. To summarize the legacy of this case is to acknowledge the failure of the institution to resolve the crisis on its own terms. We have seen how the investigation, despite its monumental scale and the inclusion of elite agencies like the FBI and the Texas Rangers, ultimately succumbed to the limitations of its time. The forensic methodology, the jurisdictional friction, and the rigid application of legal protocols were all factors that conspired to keep the truth just out of reach. This is not a critique of the individuals who worked the case. Rather, it is a sober reflection on the reality that justice, as defined by our legal systems, is an imperfect instrument. It relies on the presence of evidence, the reliability of testimony, and the adherence to procedural norms, all of which were conspicuously lacking or fundamentally flawed in the instance of the Phantom Killer. The tragedy, therefore, is double-sided. First in the loss of life and the infliction of trauma, and second in the permanent denial of the resolution that the families of the victims so rightly deserved. We have spent this time documenting the events with a commitment to accuracy and empathy, aiming to elevate the narrative above the sensationalism that so often characterizes the true crime genre. By centering the experiences of the survivors and the victims, we have sought to honor their struggle and to underscore the gravity of the events that shattered their lives. The fear that permeated Texarkana was real, visceral, and pervasive, and it is imperative that we continue to recognize the human cost of the violence that was visited upon them. The Phantom Killer was not a character in a horror movie, but a lethal reality that fundamentally changed the social and psychological landscape of the region. As we close this chapter, we do so with a renewed sense of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted, and with a profound respect for the resilience of those who, in the aftermath of such terror, were forced to find their own path toward recovery. The afterlife of the case in the cultural and artistic sphere is, in itself, a reflection of the human need to process the inexplicable. The transition of the story into the realm of film and literature is not merely an act of entertainment, but a testament to the fact that we use narratives to bind the wounds of history. By externalizing the fear, by placing it within the structure of a story, we attempt to gain a measure of control over the elements of our world that threaten to overwhelm us. The fact that the story of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders has become a cornerstone of the slasher genre is both a logical extension of our cultural processing and a reminder of how much we rely on myth-making to explain the dark, irrational pockets of our existence. The burlap mask remains a potent, terrifying icon precisely because it represents the fundamental fear of the unknown, the fear of a predator who lacks a face, a motivation, and a recognizable human boundary. As we look toward the future, the case of the Phantom Killer will continue to serve as a beacon for researchers, students of criminology, and true crime enthusiasts who are drawn to the mystery of the unresolved. It will continue to be a reference point for debates about forensic advancements, the role of federal intervention in local law enforcement, and the ethics of how we remember the victims of historical violence. The archives will remain, the reports will continue to be read, and the legend of the border town that dreaded the sundown will be passed from one generation to the next. This continuity is the most significant aspect of the case's survival. It reminds us that our history is not static. It is a living, breathing record that we actively maintain and interrogate. Even when we fail to find the answers we seek, the act of seeking is itself a valuable, enduring practice. The final reflection must belong to the victims and the community that was forced to endure the terror of the spring of 1946. Their story is the reason the mystery remains significant. It is a reminder that we are all, in a fundamental sense, interconnected, and that the suffering of one community resonates through the broader fabric of our shared history. The struggle for truth in the Texarkana case is a struggle for justice that transcends the time of the murders, reflecting our collective, ongoing commitment to seeing the truth revealed, no matter how distant or difficult it may appear. We acknowledge that the phantom will likely never be unmasked, but we also acknowledge that our efforts to remember, to analyze, and to honor the victims are themselves a form of justice, an assertion that their lives mattered and that their stories deserve to be told with dignity and care. In closing, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders stand as a permanent, unresolved monument to the challenges of human history. The case has been examined from every conceivable angle, the evidence has been debated in infinite detail, and yet the core of the mystery remains as impenetrable as it was when the first shots were fired on that lonely lover's lane. This is the nature of the unknown. It persists, it haunts, and it challenges us. We must accept this reality even as we continue to strive for clarity. The story of the Phantom is a story of the limits of our knowledge and the endurance of our memory. We leave the case here, in the records of history, where it will continue to exist as a cautionary tale, a subject of fascination, and a solemn reminder of the darkness that can emerge from the shadows of our own neighborhoods. The mystery remains, the Phantom persists in our collective imagination, and the legacy of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders will continue to serve as a definitive, haunting chapter in the great, evolving saga of the American experience, always standing at the threshold of the known, always waiting, and always serving as a testament to the complexities of the human spirit in its relentless, often futile, pursuit of the truth. We find our peace in the telling, even as the truth remains hidden in the dark, permanent night that once descended upon the town that dreaded the sun. The conclusion of the 11th movement in this exhaustive inquiry demands a shift from the clinical examination of evidence to a profound contemplation of the existential imprint left by the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. As we have meticulously reconstructed the timeline, scrutinized the investigative failures, and honored the memories of the victims, we are left with the undeniable reality that the Phantom Killer has transcended the criminal archive to become a fixture of the regional landscape. The shadow of the burlap mask has effectively merged with the geography of the border town, an intangible presence that dictates how the history of this region is perceived and articulated. To understand the lingering resonance of the case, one must appreciate how the trauma of 1946 was not merely an event, but a catalyst that redefined the communal understanding of safety and vulnerability. The transition from a quiet, post-war border town to a site of inexplicable, targeted violence created a psychological fracture that has yet to fully heal, as the absence of a definitive resolution acts as a perpetual irritant in the collective consciousness of Texarkana. The failure to identify the perpetrator, while a procedural and judicial setback, has paradoxically contributed to the survival of the narrative. In the absence of a name or a face, the Phantom has been granted a fluidity that allows it to persist in the imagination of each successive generation. This is the hallmark of a true, enduring mystery. It is not easily dismissed or filed away, but rather it invites continuous engagement. The case serves as an intellectual and emotional anchor, pulling in those who are fascinated by the intersection of human nature and inexplicable cruelty. It is a story that defies the comfortable, linear progression we expect from history, instead presenting a fractured, incomplete timeline that challenges our capacity to reconcile the past with our present understanding of justice. By refusing to conform to the expectations of a closed case, the Texarkana murders remain a living, breathing component of the regional identity, an enigma that demands to be explored rather than simply consumed. Reflecting upon the evolution of the investigation from a local police effort to a massive, multi-agency operation underscores the genuine gravity of the situation as it was perceived in real time. The involvement of the Texas Rangers and the FBI was not a reaction to the crimes alone, but to the breakdown of the social order itself. The community was not just dealing with a series of murders, it was dealing with the collapse of the foundational belief that one could live safely behind locked doors. This realization is what propelled the urgency of the manhunt, and it is what defines the legacy of the Phantom as a figure that challenged the very concept of home. The trauma was existential, a direct assault on the peace that the town had fought to preserve through the hardships of the global war. To witness the town's reaction, the militarization of the average household, the imposition of the curfew, the palpable fear that defined the night, is to witness a community fighting for its right to exist in a state of normalcy, a fight that, while successful in ending the killings, came at the cost of the town's innocence. The role of the survivors, those individuals whose lives were forever altered by their proximity to the Phantom, deserves our deepest consideration. Their resilience in the face of such profound physical and emotional violation is the bedrock upon which the human side of this narrative is built. The trauma they carried, often silently, served as a private burden that mirrored the public anxiety of the town. Their persistence in moving forward, in navigating the world with the memory of the mask and the sound of the gunshot, is the ultimate testament to the human capacity for endurance. We must always remember that for every headline about the investigation, there was a real person whose potential for joy, for connection, and for a future was violently stolen or permanently scarred. The focus on the mystery should never eclipse the humanity of those who were targeted, and the story of the Texarkana Moonlight murders should remain, first and foremost, a narrative of the victims' stolen lives and the survivors' courageous path toward reclaiming their own peace. The institutional limitations of the era provide a sobering lesson in the reality of justice. We are reminded that the machinery of the law is bound by the constraints of its time, by the technology, the social conventions, and the legal protocols that define its function. The inability to bridge the gap between strong circumstantial suspicion and ironclad legal proof is the primary hurdle that prevented the Phantom from being held accountable. This creates a lasting tension between the moral certainty that many in the community felt toward the prime suspect and the legal reality that prevented a conviction for murder. This tension is the source of the persistent, unresolved nature of the case, and it teaches us that justice is not a simple, inherent truth, but a procedural outcome that can sometimes fail even when the evidence seems aligned. This serves as a cautionary tale for any investigation, highlighting the necessity for both rigorous adherence to the law and a commitment to evolving the tools we use to pursue the truth. The cultural narrative of the Phantom, as it has been refined over the decades, has become a reflection of our own fascination with the darkness. The way we tell the story, the focus we place on the burlap mask, the way we frame the isolated roads of the past, all of this is a manifestation of our own need to interact with the unknown from a place of safety. We are drawn to the Phantom because the threat is contained within a history we have survived, allowing us to examine the nature of evil without the immediate fear of becoming its victim. This is the power of the true crime genre. It allows for an analytical engagement with the catastrophic, transforming the chaotic experience of trauma into a manageable, albeit unsettling, story. Yet, we must be careful not to mistake our consumption of the story for a genuine understanding of the reality. The mystery is not a puzzle to be solved for our amusement, but a tragedy to be understood for the lessons it provides about our shared vulnerability. As we reach this point in our exploration, we acknowledge that the mystery of the Phantom Killer is not a singular point of failure, but a complex tapestry of history, trauma, and institutional limitation. It remains, above all, a story about the borderland, not just the geographic border between states, but the psychological border between the known and the unknown, the safe and the threatened, the civilized and the savage. Texarkana became the locus of this encounter, a place where the ordinary was disrupted by an extraordinary, faceless malice. The story continues to hold our attention because it speaks to the fears that persist in our own lives, the hidden vulnerabilities that we all share. It is a narrative that will not be closed, a case that will continue to challenge the next generation of historians and truth seekers. We conclude this reflection, but the echo of the Phantom remains, a persistent, mournful sound in the history of the border town that once lived in fear of the sunset. The legacy of the Phantom Killer is thus secure, not as a name in a book, but as a cautionary monument in the vast, varied history of American crime. It serves as a permanent reference point for how communities respond to the unexplainable, how the legal system struggles with the irrational, and how we, as a society, process the persistent, haunting presence of the past. The mystery has become a part of the air, a part of the landscape, and a part of the shared memory of all who have encountered the story. We leave the Phantom in the records of the past, fully aware that the mask will never be removed, and that the face behind it, or perhaps the lack of a singular face, representing the infinite potential for human darkness, will forever remain a mystery. This is the final, unchangeable reality of the Texarkana Moonlight murders, a reality we accept with a solemn, persistent respect for the history it represents and the lives it irrevocably claimed, ensuring that even in the absence of a definitive, legal answer, the story of the town and its phantom will continue to be told, analyzed, and honored as long as there is an interest in the darkest, most enduring enigmas of the human experience. The night that descended on Texarkana in 1946 has never fully lifted. It remains a shadow that we continue to navigate, a shadow that reminds us of the fragility of our light and the enduring, persistent mystery of the dark.